Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's Tech Talk. We have Shawn Convery with us to discuss why use hooks. So I will hand it over to him.
Cool. Thanks, Abby. Before I begin, I'd like to thank CodeSmith and SingleSprout for sponsoring this talk. So let me start out by laying out what the purpose of this talk is. So I wouldn't think of this as a tutorial on React hooks. I mean, I hope you all have a better understanding of hooks and how to implement them. But fundamentally, I want you all to understand why you should make the switch from class components to React hooks. But in order to do that, you first need to understand what problems are React hooks solving. So what's wrong with class-based components? I mean, they are totally functional, and React has no plans to deprecate them, so they're not going away anytime soon. But they do have some problems. I'll go deeper into these later, but for now, we can break them down into three categories. One, general issues with JavaScript. Two, problems with lifecycle methods. And three, how hard it is to share non-visual logic. So these are actually the problems that the React team outlined at ReactConf 2018. And rather than developing three separate solutions for these problems, they came up with one: hooks. Hooks are functions that allow you to hook into React state and lifecycle features from functional components. So let's go back to the first problem I mentioned, classes. Here on the left is a React class-based component. Basically, it just renders a button that when you click it, it makes the number go up. So pretty basic 101 stuff. But there's a lot of boilerplate required to do this simple task. There's a constructor function. We have to call super because we're extending the React component. And then we have the this keyword, which is everywhere. So what's the problem with this extra code? Well, it takes more time than it should. And it creates more places where errors can occur. I know personally, there's been many times where I've forgotten to this and then drove myself crazy trying to debug my error. So how can we fix it? Well, if we wrote this as a functional component, we wouldn't have to worry about anything class related. But until 2018, React functional components couldn't hold local state. But this is where the USESTATE React hook comes in. USESTATE allows you to add state to functional components. So how does it work? When you call it, it returns an array. The first element of the array is the piece of state. And the second is the function that we can use to update only that piece of state, sort of like a very specific set state. So here we're passing in 0 into our USESTATE function, and using array destructuring, we get a counter set to 0 and set counter, which is how we can actually update that counter. And if we want to add more pieces of state, we can just call USESTATE again. And each of those pieces of state will have an accompanying update function. So let's get back to our button example. Here's how we write it as a functional component with USESTATE. Instead of having a state object with the count saved in it as a key, we have count and set count. So on the click of the button, our set count is updating count and causing a re-render. So let's compare this to the class component. Just kind of off the bat, we're cutting the code basically in half. Gone are the constructor, the super, and the render functions, and of course, all of the thises. So I realize it's only about 5 or 6 lines of code that we're getting rid of in this particular example, but this is just one button. And obviously, when you're building your own app, it's going to be a lot more complex than just a single button. So you can imagine how much less code you're going to be writing in your full app when you're using hooks. So let's move on to problem number 2, lifecycle methods. So here we have a class component with the component did mount, component did update, and component will unmount methods. So just a quick refresher, the component did mount will fire when the component mounts, the component did update will fire after every subsequent re-render, and the component will unmount will fire when the component unmounts. Pretty self-explanatory stuff. So what's the issue here? Well, instead of all of our related logic being bundled together, it's kind of like sprinkled throughout all these different methods. We're updating the title of the web page when the component mounts, but also doing this logic with the chat API. And then our component will unmount has some more chat logic, specifically an unsubscribe function. While it's not too hard to follow the related logic here, you can see how this could get kind of tangled and unwieldy pretty quickly in a more complex component. And of course, none of these methods will work in our functional components. So that's where the useEffect hook comes in. Think of useEffect as all the component lifecycle methods combined into one function. UseEffect takes a function as an argument, and that function will fire after the initial render and every re-render after that. But what about component will unmount? Well, we can also do that in our useEffect. By returning a function out of useEffect, the function will run when the component unmounts. So this is all great, but what if we want an effect similar to component did mount? Well, useEffect can also take a second argument, which is the dependency array. So the useEffect will fire once when the component is mounted, but will not fire again until the dependency changes. So in this example, we're passing in an empty array. So it will fire when the component mounts. And then since the array never changes, it's an empty array, it will never fire again. But we can also pass a variable into that dependency array. So in this example, we don't actually need to run document.title until the count changes. Otherwise, the document.title is going to be the same. So we can pass the count variable into our dependency array, and it will run when the component mounts, but it won't run again until the count changes. So let's see that last example with the useEffect hook. As you can see, our logic is no longer grouped by component life cycles. Instead, it's grouped by shared logic. So we have all of our document.title logic in one useEffect and all of our chat API logic in another useEffect. It even has some logic built in for when the component unmounts. So pretty cool. But there's still one last problem we need to cover, and that is sharing non-visual logic. So how can we do that with class-based components? Well, it's kind of complicated. To pass non-visual logic, we first have to create a function that returns a higher order function, and then we stick all the logic that we want, all the logic that we want to share inside that component. Then we pass in another component as an argument, and when we render that passed-in component, it will have all the logic that we're trying to share, which is obviously a little convoluted. Or we can use render props, but we have to wrap our components. And if we want to use multiple pieces of logic, we can quickly wind up in wrapper hell. Not great. So what's the solution? In addition to all the built-in hooks we've discussed, you can also make your own custom hooks. So let's say we have this functional component here. Inside, we have this logic where we use the useEffect hook to make a request to an outside API to get a username based on a user ID info. Then we call set display name to set our display name piece of state to that user's name. Then we just display that name in a couple of paragraph tags. But what if we had a bunch of components that were going to reuse this logic, getting a name from this API and setting our state to that name? We could just kind of copy and paste it again and again, or we could create a custom hook. So here's a basic custom hook. Custom hooks are just JavaScript functions. So we can pass in arguments, basically do anything that we would do with a normal function. This particular hook is called useDisplayName. By convention, we start all of our custom hooks with use. It's not something that's going to break the code if you don't. So we grabbed all that logic from the last slide, where we're leveraging useEffect to make this call to some outside API and setting our display name to whatever we got back from that call. So let's just quickly remember what the point of this logic is. We want to get that display name piece of state. So the last thing we need to do is just return display name out of this function. And that's our custom hook. So if we go back to our original container here, we can now just use our custom hook in our container. And when it's called, it will return back that display name piece of state from our custom hook. And then when we can render it between a couple of paragraph tags. And that's it. We just shared stateful logic. Pretty easy compared to a class component. And we can call this custom hook in as many components as we want. Each time we call it, it will have its own isolated state and effects. So you don't have to worry about any instance of the hook messing with any other ones. Now, I realize this doesn't seem particularly impressive because this hook isn't really doing a lot. But imagine if this logic was a lot more robust, or we had a bunch of different kinds of logic that we were trying to share. You can definitely see the pluses of having such a simple way to share it. So those are sort of the three main hooks that you'll be using when building your application. There's a few more that I could get into, like use context, which makes using React's context API a lot easier. But you can build plenty of apps just using useState, useEffect, and your custom hooks. So I think this is a good time to go back to my first slide and ask again, why make the switch to hooks? Well, now that you all have an answer to that question, I hope you'll start using hooks in all your future React apps. And that concludes my talk. I think I have a minute or two left if anyone has any questions. Sorry, Nate.
Hi, Shawn. Yeah, thanks for doing this talk. I want to look a bit deeper into hooks now, and this has been really helpful. But I was wondering, are there any rules about when or where you can call hooks?
All right, cool. Good question. Yeah. So basically you need to call hooks at the top level of your React functional components. So obviously you can't use them in class components, and you can't put them in any like sort of conditionals or loops or anything like that. Because basically the way that React keeps track of the different hooks is literally by keeping track of the order in which they're called. So if there's like a conditional or something like that, the order can get messed up and that can cause a lot of errors. The one caveat is that, like I did in the presentation, you can put hooks inside of custom hooks. React also has like a linter to let you know if you're calling React hooks in the wrong place. So I definitely recommend looking into that if you're still kind of feeling unsure. Does that answer your question, Nate?
Yeah, it's perfect. Thanks, Shawn.
It doesn't look like anyone else has any questions, but
if there are no more questions, then I want to thank Shawn for this amazing talk and thank everyone for coming tonight, and have a wonderful rest of your evening.